Today I'm going to answer all of the questions that you've asked me on a variety of subjects, including how to get started with traditional foods, how to deal with those picky eaters, as well as how to handle various issues that arise when making traditional foods like bone broth, ferments, cultured dairy, sourdough, and more. Plus, at the end, I'm going to answer those personal questions that many of you have asked me over the years. Hi, sweet friends. I'm Mary, and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferments, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning how to be a modern pioneer in the kitchen, consider subscribing to my channel, and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. The first thing I want to mention is if at any time you want to jump ahead, be sure to open up the description underneath this video or look in the pinned comment where I'll list timestamps covering everything that I'm going to talk about. Well, I recently put up a post on my YouTube community page, and I asked you, did you have any questions, specifically about traditional foods, but other things as well that you might be interested in knowing about? Well, I was inundated with questions, so I pulled all of them off of my community page and I tried to put them into different categories and also combine those that were somewhat similar. And while I was doing that, I also pulled some comments from various videos that I have where I wasn't able to answer those comments yet. And so this way, hopefully, all of your questions and all of my answers will be very thorough. But as I go through these questions, if I've left anything out, be sure to leave it in the comments underneath this video, and I will definitely answer it for you. Well, the first question that I got was from Astrid, and she asks, as a completely new follower to traditional foods, where do I start? What do I focus on in the beginning? And I think this is an excellent question, and it's one that I get a lot. First, we just need to back up a little and define traditional foods. But before we define traditional foods, we need to define processed foods, because I often use the expression that we're on a journey leaving a processed foods kitchen behind and moving to a traditional foods kitchen. Basically, what I mean when I use the term a processed foods kitchen is one in which where most of the foods that you have in your kitchen have already been pre-prepared for you that you've purchased at the grocery store. It could be bread, it could be jam, it could be pickles, it could be different types of condiments, it could be meals that are all mixed together and you just have to heat them up. Anything that has been pre-prepared for you that you have not made, in essence, homemade. A traditional foods kitchen, on the other hand, is one in which you buy, in essence, the raw materials. You buy the real foods, and then you turn them into the meals or the different products that you want. You make your bread or you bake your bread homemade. You make your jam. You make and maybe home can your pickles. You buy a raw chicken and you roast it with some vegetables that you've cut up. It's these types of things that in essence define the traditional foods kitchen. Plus, a very important part of a traditional foods kitchen is that you try to use every last scrap of food that you have. You basically are working towards a low waste or no waste kitchen. So you may roast a whole chicken and then you'll use any leftovers to make another meal, and then you will maybe even save every little last scrap on that chicken and maybe even get a second meal out of it, depending on how many mouths you have to feed. But then you're going to save the bones and any other little scraps, maybe some cartilage, maybe some skin, whatever the case may be, and you're going to make bone broth. And now you're going to have roast chicken bone broth that's literally, in essence, cost you pennies to make. So where does Astrid and the rest of you who have asked me this question, where do you start? What do you focus on in the beginning? And that's why I have what I call the Mastering the Basics of Nutrient-Dense Foods Cooking series. It's about 15 videos, I believe, and they're the videos that I did in the very beginning when I started my YouTube channel. And I show you how to roast a chicken, I show you how to make roast chicken bone broth. Then I show you how to make beef bone broth. I show you how to culture dairy, how to make homemade yogurt without a machine. You just need a couple of bowls. And I show you how to make ferments, starting with something simple like sauerkraut. Then we get a little more advanced, and I show you how to make a sourdough starter and how to make sourdough bread. And then I also show you how to soak and sprout grain and how to make your own sprouted flour so that you can make sprouted flour breads if you like those sort of Ezekiel type breads that are sold at the grocery store. And so basically what I do is walk you through all of the basics of making traditional nutrient-dense foods. And I start you off very easy showing you how to make a simple roast chicken. So that's the place where I always tell you to start first, because most people like a roast chicken. And that's an easy place to start, and it's an easy meal to feed yourself, your family, your friends. Most people are going to enjoy. It's not like I'm going to start you off with saying, okay, you're going to make liver. And then you tell everybody, okay, we got liver for dinner. That's when you may run into a little bit of a problem where people are a little resistant. But you bring a beautiful roast chicken to the table, and you've got some carrots and some potatoes with it and whatever other veggies you enjoy. It's usually a welcome meal. Plus, it fills your home with a wonderful aroma. And then when you use those scraps to make chicken bone broth, you can use that as a base to make a nice soup, or you can also use it in place of water whenever you're making some type of grain in which would call for water, like rice or cooking rice or other grains. So little by little, you start incorporating these wonderful foods into your diet, and it's in essence painless. It's enjoyable. It's something that everyone is welcome, and when you start that everyone will welcome at the table. And when you start to make real food, the taste is so much richer and so much more delicious than anything that you can buy that's been pre-prepared for you. Your palate is going to begin to crave it. So that's basically where I say, start with a roast chicken, and I'll be sure to link to that playlist that'll walk you through very easily, little by little, step by step, to embracing a traditional foods kitchen, and little by little making that transition from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen. This does not need to be done in one day, and it shouldn't be done in one day. Do this gradually. It can take a year or two until you're, and in essence, until you have a full up and running traditional foods kitchen, and one in which you're really enjoying making these foods, and you've got a nice rhythm going in your kitchen, and you feel very successful because you've not tried to rush the process. So I'll definitely link to that playlist where I've grouped all of those videos together for you. It's basically like a master class in making traditional foods, and I think you're going to find it incredibly helpful. Just start with video number 1 and take your time working through the entire class. Also, something that I want to mention, if you don't already have the book Nourishing Traditions by Sally Fallon, I highly recommend that you get that book and add that to your kitchen library. That is a wonderful book that has hundreds of recipes in it. And the introduction alone, I think it's maybe 70 pages, the introduction alone is worth the cost of the book. And it's not an expensive book, it's an oversized paperback. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful recipe. It's a wonderful education, first of all, in the beginning, and then it's a wonderful cookbook filled with recipes that you can add little by little to your repertoire once you get the basics under your belt, so to speak. Once you go through those 15 videos that I have for you on mastering the basics of these traditional foods, then you can start looking through all of the recipes Sally has in her cookbook and expanding your repertoire. So I highly recommend that. Now, after we've discussed where to begin, where to start, I just want to jump ahead because I got a wonderful question, and this kind of goes back to what I mentioned in the introduction of this video, dealing with picky eaters, because I get this question so much. How do you deal with people, sometimes adults, but often children, who don't want to eat homemade food. And I understand completely. This can be very challenging, especially depending on the age of the child when you try to introduce traditional foods. What is the best way to go about this? And so that does go back a little bit to the first question that I answered about where to begin. You want to do this slowly. And the foods that you introduce, you want to be very flavorful, very palatable. There's scientists, I guess there's something that scientists say, is that children's palates are much more in tune, so to speak, to the intensity of flavor, as opposed to older adults, or adults, and especially as you age, your ability to taste becomes less. So foods don't taste as strong to you, whereas to children they may taste very strong. But the more flavorful we can make them and the more mild often we can make them can make the foods more attractive in terms of getting the child to eat them. But I want to share with you, I loved this question, and it was from a J. Hildebrand. And please forgive me as we go through this. Some people use their actual name. Other people use funny, cute little, what would you call it, a handle on YouTube. So if I mispronounce anything, you know I'm the queen of mispronunciation. So if I mispronounce anything, please excuse me. But this question came from J. Hildebrand. And I thought this was just an outstanding question. And as I said, in addition to where do I start, this is probably one of the other most popular questions that I get. And so I really wanted to address this. And Jay asked, what do you recommend for very picky children? I am trying to turn our lives around from a highly processed life. And my kids, 4 and 7 years old, are resisting due to the bad habits. Well, God bless you. I don't know if they're bad habits. I think as mothers and fathers, we do the best that we can. But she says, are resisting due to the bad habits I allowed them to develop. And she says, thanks, Miss Mary, Godspeed. Well, I have to share with you a story as to how my mother handled this. So I cannot take credit for this. This is how my mother handled things. My son has basically been raised on traditional foods. I was making all of these things as my mother made when he was a baby. And once he transitioned to solid food, he was getting these various foods. And so his palate was very adjusted to them. However, even when we came to liver, I had to use kind of a few little sneaky tricks. And I think I've shared this in my video about beef liver, where I cut it into small pieces, batter dip it, fry it in beef tallow, and then serve it with fermented ketchup, and I call it nuggets. And I remember the first time I gave it to my son, and he looked at it and he said, what is this? I said, oh, it's nuggets. Just dip it in the ketchup. It's delicious. And we just moved on, and he was a good egg about it. But what I will share with you is that first of all, I have to tell you, my mother is 98 years old, so I think she knows a thing or two. But she is probably one of the sweetest ladies you would ever meet. She never has an unkind word for anyone. And the neighborhood children always loved her. And as a matter of fact, when I was an adult and I would come visit my mom, I would often come into the house and she would have a couple of children around her table who would be eating and playing music, and it was always very, very cute. So know that everyone loved her, especially children, and saw her as very loving and kind. So I think her method in terms of getting children to eat, even the picky ones, worked very well. Well, this is how it all worked. When I was a child and I would have my little playmates over and my mom would be making lunch for everyone, she might be making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches or peanut butter and jam sandwiches, for example. Now, my mother was a very early version of what we often hear the term used today, like a crunchy granola mama. Although my mother was very sophisticated and very refined, my mother was very much a crunchy granola mama. She believed in eating real food, whole food, She was a fan of, back in the day, an author named Adele Davis. My mother very much believed you were what you ate, and so she really, and her whole focus was always on good digestion. So she made everything homemade. She really was the consummate homemaker. Very, very few things were purchased at the grocery store that were what she would have called a prepared food or a pre-prepared food. Pretty much everything was made homemade. And it was very cute because my little friends would come over and my mother would be slicing her whole wheat bread, her homemade whole wheat bread, and she would get out some homemade jam. And if we had peanut butter, it definitely was something where my mother took peanuts and ground them in the blender, or she somehow would search out something that was just ground peanuts. She was never one to buy any peanut butter that had a lot of sugar in it or any type of oil. She was always reading the ingredients at the grocery store. And so everything was very natural in our household. So some of my little playmates would be kind of looking, their eyes would be darting, watching my mother like this as she was slicing her whole wheat bread and removing the canning lid, from her jam. Or back then, I don't even think they were canning lids. I remember it being like wax that she would just kind of pull off on top of her jar. And then the very natural looking kind of chunky peanut butter. So the children would be seeing this and they would say, "Oh, Miss Gloria, my mom buys Welch's grape jelly. I don't eat anything but Welch's grape jelly." And my mother would say, "Oh, that's so nice." And then she would just keep making the food. And then someone else might say, "Oh, Miss Gloria, my mom only buys Jif peanut butter." And my mom would say, "That's very nice." And then someone else might go, "Oh, Miss Gloria, my mom only buys, Wonder Bread." And my mother would go, "That's very nice." And then she would just keep cooking. And she was very sincere about it. She may not agree with those particular foods for whatever reasons, but she was very polite about it and very sweet. And she would just keep making the sandwiches and then whatever beverage she was serving and maybe some fruit on the side and so on and so forth. And the children would be put down in front of them and they would just kind of look at it. Now I was raised that you ate what was in front of you. Otherwise you were, there wasn't any option. My mother was never a short order cook. She made 3 meals a day, and whatever those meals were, that was what we were going to eat. There was no options. There was no everyone getting something different. Now, certainly, if someone had an allergy or whatnot, she would have definitely respected that. But when I was growing up, I don't remember anyone having any allergies. It just wasn't common like it is today. So, but in any event, the children would look sometimes at the food in front of them, and there'd be the face, and I'd just be eating away, knowing that that's what we were going to have. And my mother's food was actually very delicious. Her whole wheat bread and sourdough breads, they were great. And her homemade jams and the peanut butter, I was so used to it, and I always thought it was very tasty. And sometimes the kids wouldn't eat anything. My mother didn't say anything. She didn't say you have to take one taste. Nothing. It was just sitting there in front of them while I was eating, and maybe some of my other little playmates who had been raised like me. You ate what was in front of you. And we would all be eating and talking and whatnot. And then the playing would go on, for the rest of the day, whatever, and maybe that meal would just be left on the table, and my mom would just leave it there. And then eventually, somebody might get a little hungry, and they would have seen us having cleaned our plate. And so they might come back into the kitchen and say, "Oh, Miss Gloria, is my sandwich still there?" or whatever. And my mom would go, "Oh, definitely, it's right there." And they might take a little bite, and then they'd find that, maybe Miss Gloria's food was pretty tasty. And over time, after a few episodes of this, and our house was, especially, after school or, in the summer, people were coming in and out of the house, the way kids are, or were, back then. We all, lived in the neighborhood together. And people got very used to how my mom was going to be, and they knew there was no short order cook. And there were no options. It was whatever Miss Gloria was serving, and that's what you were going to eat. And that her food was actually really good. And I think her meatball subs were probably some of the most popular things in the neighborhood. So I think when it comes to dealing with picky eaters, it has to be turned into almost a non-event. That's what I really observed with my mom. She served the meal. If there were complaints or whatever, amongst other kids. Now, my mom just had me, but my cousin often spent a lot of time with us. Her dad had passed away and her mom had gone back to work. And she would, every once in a while buck the system a little. But my mom had no fanfare. She wouldn't even really respond to it or acknowledge it. It was amazing. She would just serve the food and be happy and be eating, and then she'd be washing the dishes or whatever and going about her homemaking life. And there was no fanfare. And I think that is something that even if children are not happy with what's in front of them, yet it's good, nutritious food and it's been made flavorful, I think that they will, at some point, be open to giving it a try. Now, I'm saying this basically on what I observed my own mom doing with various neighborhood kids. I was somewhat lucky in that I started raising my son on these foods. So I never started with a system where I was making different foods for my husband and me and something different for him. Even when he started going to eating real food, I would just be cutting up little pieces of whatever we were eating. So I share this not as an expert, but maybe as an option of something to try, to serve a meal, not have any fanfare about it. If the children are pushing it away or saying they don't want it or complaining, maybe just trying to smile and continue with the dinner conversation. That's basically what my mother did. She didn't seem to give any recognition to anybody complaining about food. She just would kind of keep things rolling. It was so interesting, and eventually everything would calm down, and at some point every child in the house was eating whatever she was serving. So I don't know, maybe there's something to that, just not having a lot of fanfare about it. And also, too, my mother definitely was of the school of thought that depending on where you live, she felt that most children living in the community in which, we live, just sort of, middle-class America, that most children were very, as my mother would say, were very well fed. And no one was going to go and starve overnight if they wound up not eating the dinner that they liked. So I had something to try. No fanfare. She never said, take one bite, you have to try everything. Nothing. It was served, and if when dinner was over and it was time to clean up, she'd leave it there for a little bit, but then eventually it was put away. And that was that. So I'm not an expert on this, but I did want to share with you my mother's approach to things. And I do find it very cute that even as an adult, I would come home and there would be kids in our kitchen eating whatever she was making. And I just want to add one thing about serving food to young children, and this could actually even apply to middle school and high school. As I've shared with you, I homeschooled my son through 8th grade, but he did go to high school, brick and mortar high school, outside of home. And one thing that I think he really enjoyed was the school that he went to didn't have a cafeteria, so everyone had to bring lunch. And I think the one thing that he really enjoyed was he always had some kind of bento box arrangement. And I would put really what you might describe as like fun foods, but traditional foods in his bento box. And every other kid would often say to him, "Wow, your mother sends a really good lunch." And it really wasn't anything fancy. I would often just have very nice breads with a very nice sandwich filling, homemade breads. And I would also use a lot of little things that I found at Asian grocery stores. Japanese grocery stores often offer a lot of options for making very nice lunches. And they have tiny little cookie cutters and things like this where you can make vegetables in cute shapes and whatnot. But I would have maybe a nice sandwich made on sourdough bread with a nice filling. And then I would have maybe some fermented vegetables that were like a giardiniera. And I have recipes for all of these things with videos, along the video along with the printable recipe. And I'll try to put as much as I can in the description underneath this video. And if I run out of space, I'll always add additional recipe links in the pinned comment where I have a little more space to work with. But a giardiniera, it's an Italian vegetable mix, and I would ferment it, so he would have these wonderful fermented vegetables, and it would look very colorful and very tasty. They can either be tangy, or you can make them sweet and tangy by adding a little sweetener later. That's a question that I have in here that we're going to talk about when we get to ferments. And then I would have like a lovely, maybe some grapes or a lovely fruit melody. Different things like that, maybe some homemade cookies. When my son was growing up, cowboy cookies, were popular in our home. They're made with oatmeal and spelt flour and things like that. And I would prepare it as lovingly, as I could, often as much as I could the night before. So we weren't like having the mad dash in the morning, because the high school was pretty far from here. A good 45 minutes or an hour if traffic was heavy. So there are ways to make the food look very attractive when you're serving it. But even if you're doing it at the dinner hour, it can be attractive to everyone enjoying it. A giardiniera is just a bunch of cut up vegetables, as I mentioned, that you fermented, and you can add a little sweetener, and they're very tasty. Bread and butter pickles, you can ferment those, and you always add the sweetener after the fact, and they're very delicious. So there's different things that you can do to make food look cute, cut it up in small pieces or whatever the case may be, depending on the age of the child. And my son, this was funny. Now, every mother and father has to make determinations on how best to handle these things with children. But my son really enjoyed having fancy little, they're not toothpicks, because I wouldn't want to give a toothpick, to a young child, but they were like longer plastic utensils. I'll pull some out of my pantry and include a picture for you. And they actually were things that belonged to my mother, but probably things you could find today. And they were very cute little, and they were often plastic, cute little, I think for adults they would have been used to eat hors d'oeuvres or serve hors d'oeuvres. And he loved all these little things. He felt that he was doing something very fancy, and he would use these little hors d'oeuvre forks to pick up and eat the food that I had cut up for him. And so there's a lot of little creative ways, but I think the bottom line is we have to do our best to make the food as tasty. And you hear, you eat with your senses, all of your senses. You eat with your eyes first, your nose, what's the aroma that you're smelling, and does the food, look attractive and look colorful, or is the skin on the chicken crispy, and things like that. So I think that's the focus, is as we are on this journey of becoming traditional food cooks, are we making the food as tasty and as attractive as possible? So that's that. But in any event, I'm just going to kind of stay on this trend, and then I'll go back to the beginning, because I want to walk us through all the different areas of traditional foods and answer the questions that I received. But the next question that I had received along this, how to feed different eaters, comes from Muddy Shoes Gardener. So cute. So Muddy Shoes Gardener says, my adult son is following a modified lower carb eating plan. Not keto. She specifies as it's not keto. I'm a keto dropout, so I can understand not doing keto. But he's following this lower carb eating plan. This last year, he has lost 60 pounds. Amazing. I would like to support his new choices, but I generally eat a high-carb diet. Any ideas, suggestions? Thank you. This is another great question, because not only might you be dealing with children who have specific eating patterns, and again, something my mother didn't have to deal with, allergies, so you may be dealing with these types of things, or you may be dealing with adults who follow different dietary regimes. So how do you handle all of this without making yourself a little crazy in the kitchen? And I think the answer to Muddy Shoes Gardener, as well as any of the rest of you who are dealing with this is what is so wonderful about traditional foods. Because if you make a full traditional foods meal, there are usually a lot of options for everyone. For example, in the case of having a lower carb eating plan and a high carb diet, and having these people both at the same table, you can cook your protein. We'll just use a roast chicken as an example. I've often shared in videos I could roast a chicken every day if my family would put up with me. But if you're doing, for example, a roast chicken, you can have lots of low-carb vegetables as the sides, as well as some high-carb options. You could have potatoes, or you could have rice that's maybe been cooked in bone broth, or you could have some type of grain. So the person who eats the more lower carb diet may enjoy the chicken, maybe a very small portion of the grains, or maybe a quarter of a potato, or maybe a quarter cup of the corn if you serve corn. And then, maybe a few of the carrots. I know sometimes lower carb diets or keto diets, people avoid carrots because of the natural sugars in them. You could have a green beans, which is like a good lower carb option. So there are various ways that you can make your meal to have those higher carb foods for yourself, so you can maybe have half your plate with your starchier foods, and maybe a quarter of your plate with your protein, and then maybe a quarter of your plate with your lower carb veggies, because it's good to have a variety regardless. And then the person, your son, for example, enjoying a lower carb diet would probably have a larger portion of protein, a larger portion of the lower carb veggies, and then maybe a very small portion of the higher carb options. So that's a relatively easy one to work around. So what do you do when you have vegetarians in the family? The vegan diet I am not very familiar with, because I am shocked sometimes when I learn certain things about it, that sometimes people, they can't even have honey because it may have the bees' saliva in it and things like this. That's a tough one for me, and it's difficult for me to imagine having to just make vegan meals and how careful you would need to be. So that's definitely something that does require time and research. And I think it's a lot easier to feed a vegetarian, and especially if you have a lacto-ovo vegetarian, someone who is taking milk or dairy-based foods and eggs, even easier. But when you have a multiple varied people at your table who are following various diets, I think if you start with some basics, for example, if everybody or most of the people are gluten-free, you can make your gluten-free breads. I have a video where I go over all of the various options to use for making gluten-free flours so that you can prepare them homemade and not necessarily buy those gluten-free mixes, which can sometimes become rather costly as compared to buying the basic ingredients and then mixing your own gluten-free flour. And as I said, I'll link to that video so that you can learn more about it if you're new to gluten-free or you're just starting to have to bake gluten-free. But I think the main thing is you look at all of the basics under sort of the traditional foods umbrella. Your bone broth, your cultured dairy, your ferments, your sourdough bread, your sprouted flour breads or baked goods, and then you look at, your meats, your red meat, your chickens or other fowl, and your fish. Preferably, I've told you I'm not a fuss budget about this stuff, especially now when money is so tight and inflation is so high and grocery prices sometimes seem like they're spiraling out of control. I'm never going to be the one that tells you, you have to buy organic, you have to buy grass-fed. Is that wonderful? Yes, I love it. But sometimes all you can do is the best you can do. But eventually, if over time and you start buying less prepared foods and they're usually more expensive, you find you have a little more wiggle room in your grocery budget and you can start incorporating, grass-fed meats, wild-caught fish, so on and so forth. But in the beginning, buy the best chicken you can buy, and don't worry initially, if it's pasture-raised or not. I'm a firm believer that a whole chicken roasted at home and served at the dinner table is better than anything you can buy pre-prepared, anything you can buy at a fast food restaurant, regardless of how the chicken was raised. And I know I take a lot of flack for that, but it's really something, in my humble opinion, that I think a home-cooked meal with real food is just so nutritious. And I could wax a little poetic about it, not only for the physical body, but I feel it can be very comforting and soothing to the soul. But in any event, I think you look at everything that you have in your pantry, in your, as I often say, the four corners pantry. What do you have in your working pantry? What do you have in your fridge? What do you have in your freezer? What do you have in your extended pantry, your backup pantry, your prepper pantry, where you keep non-perishables that refill your your working pantry? And look at everything you have, and then think of all of your basics, and then think of everybody you have to feed. What in those basics can everybody eat? Can everybody eat beef? No. Okay. Can everybody eat chicken? Maybe. Can everybody eat fish? There may be a potential there. My mother-in-law is a pescatarian. So beef and chicken are kind of going to be off her radar, but fish is going to be welcome. And so you just have to start to think, who am I feeding and what can I make that pretty much can fit most diets? Now, you may be making a chicken for yourself or maybe a number of people at your dinner table, but there may be some people who don't eat chicken. So maybe when you are preparing your meal and you're thinking of everything that's under your traditional foods umbrella, what can they enjoy? I have recipes where I share with you various super mineral broths. They're vegetable-based. I also have something called a golden broth. It's very similar to a chicken bone broth, but it's completely vegetarian, and I probably even vegan, and I will definitely click to that or link to that, and you can use that as a base for a soup that will be very pleasing to anyone in your family, including those that are not vegetarians or vegans. They're going to think they're taking something with chicken broth. And you can use that as a base for your soup, and you can have that in your refrigerator along with chicken bone broth or beef bone broth or whatever the case may be, when you're feeding those that don't need those more specific options. Then look at ferments. What under your umbrella of ferments can you feed to everybody at the table? What under your umbrella of cultured dairy can you feed to everybody at your table? And when I use cultured dairy, you could almost put dairy in quotes. Yes, you might be served, maybe everybody can take yogurt, maybe everybody can take kefir or kefir, depending on how you pronounce it. But there are a lot of options. You can make your own homemade oat milk, which I highly recommend, and it's much better than anything you can buy at the store. You can also make rice milk, and you can use these to then culture and serve these types of things to your family. Coconut milk is a wonderful option because that is often very easy to buy, and you can buy the whole full fat coconut milk, which I definitely recommend, and that can also be cultured. So there's a lot of different things that you can do when you're thinking of that traditional foods umbrella. And then you want to make sure you have those things in your pantry so that you're prepared. So when you go to make your meals and you know everybody that you're feeding, you can say, okay, I can prepare traditional nutrient-dense foods that for the most part, everyone at my table is going to be able to eat and enjoy. So that's all you want to do is work through that. Often if people, and this is something that when it comes to bread, yes, today you hear of many people having a gluten intolerance, but you may also read that sometimes people who think they're just gluten sensitive may just need their digestive tracts brought back to good health. They're not intolerant, they don't have like celiac disease. Obviously, this is very important that these people don't eat gluten-based products. But sometimes if you just find that you have a little trouble digesting bread, but you don't have any major event over it, often your gut health needs to be improved. And that's where ferments and cultured dairy play a very big role on helping to reinstitute some good bacteria, the probiotics in your gut. And then you feed them with foods, the prebiotics, I'm saying that correctly, the prebiotics that feed the probiotics. And so you work at getting your gut health in better condition. And I have a lot of videos where I talk about this, and I definitely, as I said, I'll link to everything so that you can click on and watch the videos or read the blog posts that are of specific interest to you. But often, people who may feel they're sensitive to gluten, they don't have an allergy or anything like that, but they just sometimes find they have a little problem digesting bread. It's often because the bread is not properly prepared. And this is something that you probably hear me say a lot. It's so important to not just eat real food, but to eat real food that has been properly prepared. And what does properly prepared mean? It means that we're going to soak. It means we're going to culture. It means we're going to ferment, and so on and so forth. And so often, if you start developing a sourdough starter, and then you start making sourdough bread, and you can just make your sourdough bread initially with all-purpose flour or bread flour, that both of those have had the bran and the germ removed. So you're basically using what many of us will call a white flour or a plain flour, but you're making it with a sourdough starter. And sourdough, when it goes through the fermentation process, helps. The fermentation process is basically gobbling up and eating a lot of things in flour that may make it difficult for people to digest. And now that you've gone through the fermentation process of souring it, in essence, and then making a sourdough bread, often people who thought maybe they had a gluten sensitivity, now I'm not talking about people who are completely intolerant and have celiac disease and all of that, no. But people who thought maybe they just had some trouble digesting bread find that when they eat the sourdough bread, it agrees with them completely and they feel fine. And if you've got some homemade butter that you've made from cream that you've cultured, if they can take a dairy product and you slather some butter on it, maybe sprinkle it with a little bit of a coarse ground sea salt, you're making something very delicious. My son to this day considers sourdough toast with lots of butter, lots of cultured butter, and sprinkled with sea salt, one of his greatest comfort foods. And so what I'm trying to say through all of this is that as you think about who is around your table and who you're feeding, and when you go shopping for your real foods, your whole foods, real food, not the store, but real whole foods, think about what you're ultimately going to turn those into, and do those ingredients agree with the majority of the people at your table? And then take those real whole ingredients and turn them into the various traditional foods that you want. Whether it's roasting a chicken, whether it's just buying, everything can get so expensive today. Never forget eggs, and even eggs are expensive, but eggs are a little powerhouse of nutrition. And you can scramble up some eggs, especially if you do have vegetarians, but if they're lacto-ovo vegetarians, and you can scramble up some eggs. You can make a frittata, so easy to do. You can make a quiche. You can make just plain old, breakfast for dinner. It's so common, especially when you're tired. Scramble up a big batch of eggs, bring some sourdough toast to the table, have plenty of butter, some sea salt, maybe you grill up a little, some sausage or bacon, or even if you're not up to doing that, you just bring out some of your ferments, Maybe you've got a homemade salsa and you can top the eggs with that. So there are a lot of things that you can do. It's just a matter of knowing who's at your table, stocking your pantry with what you're going to need to make traditional foods that then can be consumed by most of the people. If you're going to be making a lot of soups and stews that are vegetable-based because you have a lot of vegetarians in the home, make these super nutrient-rich vegetable broths. These super broths, as I call them, and make the golden broths. And I'll link to all of these things. But it's all about focusing on who's at your table and stocking your pantry with what you need to make the foods that everybody's going to be able to eat. Now, is everybody going to eat everything? Maybe not. If you're roasting a chicken, but you have plenty of sides, pretty much, and you also maybe have some sourdough bread, and, for the people who take dairy, you've got some homemade butter. For people who don't take dairy, maybe you've got some homemade cheeses that were not, or are maybe, oat milk based or nut based, different things like that. And so you have enough on your table that you can pull out of your fridge that maybe you've made in advance to make life even easier. Everyone is most likely going to leave the table feeling full and well fed. The next question came from, and forgive me, this is a tough name for me, but I think it's Samina and Samina Iosif. And she is basically asking me about the concerns of how bad sugar can be, and especially for children. And she shares that she is the mother of 2 small children and would like to hear my opinion on both sugar and low carb. So that's interesting. Well, I'll tell you very honestly, for me, what I find really works best is eating a nice mix of traditional foods and when it comes to dieting, trying to do the best I can with intermittent fasting, trying not to eat after 5 o'clock and not eating, until the next day when I start with my coffee. But in terms of specifically with children, I never fed my son a low-carb diet. I mean, I gave him a good, I would say very much along the lines of what Sally Fallon talks about in Nourishing Traditions. 40% carbs, 40% fat, and maybe 20% protein. Maybe even, more, I'm not, maybe a little less fat, a little more protein, not 100% sure, but she talks about in her book that is kind of the traditional. Now, do certain cultures eat more and certain cultures eat less? Yes, it's all dependent on where they are on our planet and what is available to them. But when you average it all out, she says most traditional diets average, in the end to be about that 40-40-20 ratio. But my son drank a lot of raw milk as a kid. That's one thing I can say. He had a lot of raw milk, and that's got everything, protein, carbs, and fat in it. He had a lot of butter. He had a lot of raw cream. So these were kind of the foods that he ate as a child. I did not serve a lot of sugar, and I really I don't use a lot of white sugar in my cooking or in my household. I do use it when I make homemade jams that I'm going to home can, water bath can, and the reason is I have found that you can run into a little bit of a problem sometimes. I'd be interested in hearing from other home canners your thoughts on this, but sometimes alternative whole sugars can be a problem with potential burning because of all of the molasses, everything's still intact, versus white sugar, which is very easy to use when making a jam and then home canning it. However, I wasn't really home canning a lot of jams when he was young. He loved cranberry sauce. So whenever I could get cranberries, I would make fresh or frozen whole cranberries. I would make a cranberry sauce, and it'd be sort of like a jam. And I would use either the sucanat. So some of you may know it as rapadura. It's the dried whole sugar cane, or dry. I think that's how they say it. And I always had a good supply of that on hand. Or I might use maple sugar. Maple sugar has become very expensive now, so it's kind of reserved for special occasions. But those were the primary sweeteners that I used. And then molasses in various baking, like a gingerbread or something that called for that rich, dark flavor. But for the most part, I really limited having any white sugar in our kitchen, my traditional foods kitchen. And to this day, my son doesn't have a huge sweet tooth. He really enjoys real food. He enjoys, the meats and the vegetables. He loves salads. And it's cute because he's a real olive oil and vinegar dressing kind of guy on his salads. So he's just developed those habits over the course of his lifetime. So I do think limiting white sugar is very important, because something I will say, my son is in his mid-20s now, and he has never had a cavity. And I think that has to do, number one, with drinking a lot of raw milk as a child, and number two, never really having much white sugar in his diet. And he has nice, beautiful, strong teeth, and so I'm very grateful for that. So that's kind of, my opinion, just in my own personal kitchen. But in terms of the sugar, now let's talk about the carbs. I do think when you have a traditional foods diet where you're eating real food, you may not need to limit carbs, assuming that they're real whole foods. Like a sweet potato is a carb, sourdough bread is a carb, whole grain breads and whole grains are carbs, But beans, for example, those are carbs, as well as, having the protein in them. I don't think children get fat eating those foods. And so I don't think those type of carbs need to be limited. Something I will share that I found very interesting. My son was always slim and trim, strong, but slim and trim as a child, and he's slim and trim as a man. And it was cute because in the early years, the pediatrician would say, what do you feed him? He's in very good health. What do you feed him? And, I sort of hesitantly was like, well, we drink raw milk, and it's whole, obviously it's in the form it comes out of the cow. And in the beginning, she would say, oh, you've got to get him on, low fat or fat-free milk, and, kind of giving me that standard American diet, the SAD diet, standard American diet. But, and I would smile and thank you, and we'd leave, and then I'd get home and in my own kitchen do what I wanted to do. I felt that I was feeding him nutritiously, and he was developing well. And it's kind of funny because the years went on, and he was, maybe 7, 8 years old at this point, something like that. And one day we were in the office and we were chatting, and she said, are you still do you do low-fat milk, or what do you do? Are you still doing raw milk? And I said, oh, no, we drink raw milk. I said, I'm sorry, I didn't follow your recommendations. And she said, no, I'm really actually very interested in hearing what you feed your son, because he's slim and trim, he's got good muscle tone, he's healthy, and so many of the children I see, are already having weight problems and developing so strange, what we would call adult onset diabetes that these young children were developing. And so I just shared with her about Sally Fallon and the cookbook I had, Nourishing Traditions, and how I had been raised, and with my own mom making a lot of these homemade foods, and now how I was feeding my son all these homemade foods. And she was very interested and very open to it. And so I think that there's no need to limit carbs when they're real carbs, when they're real food. Now, if a child has already developed a weight problem, and I really can't speak to this because I've not had to deal with this with a child, but there may need to be some help in terms of structuring an appropriate diet and whatnot, but obviously increasing activity and not so much, they say today the kids are on the couch a lot with the computer and so on and so forth. But I think that when you start eating a traditional foods diet as a young person, it is easier to become slim and trim because you're eating real foods. And the body knows how to process these real foods, as opposed to a lot of the processed foods at the grocery store that are often high in white sugar, or even worse, like high fructose corn syrup, which they say can lead, to being very overweight, and the very processed fats, fats that are very damaged and that the body doesn't exactly know what to do with. And often I've read, and there are people who are experts on this, I'm not at all, but different scientific articles that I've read that are fascinating, that when you have foods that have been very highly processed or very damaged, as is in the case with a lot of these processed fats that are used in many products today, that the body doesn't quite know what to do with it. And they often wind up just storing it as fat, as opposed to real foods that the body knows what to do with and how to use and how to burn as fuel. And so people who tend to eat real foods then tend to be a little more efficient at burning calories. So I think when it comes to kids, yes, limiting white sugar, I'm all for that. Low carb, I'm not so sure I really see the benefit in it. And I will share a story with you that a friend of mine who is a mother of 5, she had experimented with a lot of different diets with her children. And we got to chatting one day, and she had completely overhauled everything and was doing very much nourishing traditions. And I think she had really been limiting carbs. And not that her children had weight problems, she just felt low carb was maybe a better way to go. And she found that her children didn't do as well, that they were more hungry and more tired, and the different things that she had shared with me that she had observed. So she said, I don't think this is the way to go. I'm going to start bringing back more of your higher carb vegetables, more of your whole grain breads and beans. And she brought these things back into their diet, and all properly prepared. The beans should be soaked and cooked well and so on and so forth for proper digestion and proper absorption of nutrients and so on and so forth. And she noticed that her children's vibrancy returned to them. So that, it's anecdotal and simply what she has shared with me. But over the years, back when I was a homeschool mom, in my homeschool social circle, there were a lot of, obviously a lot of mothers in our homeschool social circle who also had a lot of children. And I never remember and everybody was doing nourishing traditions. And I never remember any of the children being overweight. All of the kids were eating whole real foods. All of the children were doing their academics as well as being very active. And so I think it's that combination of being active, eating a real foods diet, as my mother would say, getting plenty of fresh air and sunshine. That was her cure for everything, fresh air and sunshine. Go out and play, get fresh air and sunshine. And so I think that you limit sugar, but not so much, and again, my humble opinion, not so much the need to limit carbs as long as they're real food, real carbs. Now, I want to go back to the beginning. Now, I did get a lot, it's cute. I'm flattered. Many of you gave me a lot of questions where you asked me about myself and my own, some personal things, about my life, which I'm happy to share with you. But I'll save those to the end because I really want to address the traditional foods questions first and foremost. And basically what I've done is I've tried to group the questions together under the categories of bone broth, culturing dairy, and then I've got fermentation. And boy, fermentation, I get a lot of questions. I'd probably say the two areas that I get the most questions are fermentation and sourdough. And then I've got some questions about herbal remedies / home remedies. And then I got a number of questions. I think I'm filming this, as we go into the holidays. And so I got a lot of questions about my Christmas menu, which I will share with you. I did have some questions about oats, some questions about the prepper pantry, which is, it's that area of the Four Corners pantry, as I mentioned earlier, where we store our non-perishable foods to basically go shopping there to refill our working pantry. And that can come in very handy. Why do we do that? Is because in the event that we can't get out, whatever the case may be, bad weather or illness or job loss, money's just not available, or like everything we went through these last couple of years, sometimes you just can't leave the house. And so having your own extended supply of food can be very helpful. And I will just say one thing, that's something we found, obviously our prepper pantry served us very well during 2020, but in 2021, I'm jumping ahead a little here. I'll go back to bone broth in a minute. But jumping ahead to 2021, when I live in Central Texas, and we had a terrible ice / snowstorm. They called it Snowmageddon, I think, Snowmageddon. And we lost power. But some people didn't have water. And it was unprecedented. And they say that it really only happens maybe every 100 years here in the area where we live in Texas. But having the prepper pantry then really served us well. And the prepper pantry is so much more, which I learned can serve so much more benefit to you than just having some non-perishable foods. You want to have, especially if you're the homemaker, you know, man or woman, if you're the homemaker and you are in charge of that prepper pantry, having important things that, you know, like flashlights and emergency radios and a whole host of other things, which I have a video where I share with you the whole host of things that my husband and I keep in our home and our son keeps in his home, so that we are prepared for emergency situations like we were in. And because we were prepared, we were able to help friends and neighbors with water and firewood, which really were probably two of the most important things, with people not having clean water, not having any water, and not having any heat. So we'll talk about that a little more in detail, but I will link to that. That's a very important video, and I will link to that for you, because in that video I share so many things: how to keep medication cold if you have injectable medications but you have no electricity, how to cook food when you have no electricity, and maybe you're in a place where you can't use a grill outside, or you can't even have a grill on a patio or something. How do you warm some food, you know? How do you make a cup of coffee? I cover all of that, so that'll be very helpful to you. Plus, I have a second video in that series where I discuss how to prepare a bug out bag for yourself as well as other members of your family, and as well as how to prepare for your pets in the event that you need to evacuate. Two common problems here in Central Texas can be floods and tornadoes. Thank God we've never had to evacuate, and we have a place in our home that has no windows under our stairwell where we can sequester ourselves, so to speak, in the event of a tornado warning. And we're lucky that we're not in a floodplain, but a lot of people are, and a lot of people have had to evacuate for one reason or another. And so you never know what's going to happen, and so I always like to be prepared for that. And so I will definitely share those with you. But in any event, I could talk about being prepared and the prepper pantry. I could really spend a lot of time on that. It's a subject that my son and I joke, because we really, and my husband also is very involved in it, but my son and I have a lot of fun chit-chatting about it, because we used to love to watch a TV show, and gosh, I can't remember the name of it. Maybe some of you will, and you can put it in the comments. It was something about people who were preparing for, they might say the apocalypse or something like this. I don't know. They were very extreme, and it was very, but we really enjoyed it, because one of the episodes was based on a man who lives somewhere here in Central Texas. And it was really cute, because when he was being interviewed, he said, "This is not a hobby. This is a lifestyle." And so now my son and I will often joke when we see each other. We'll go, if we're buying something to add to our preparedness, we'll joke and we'll go, "This is not a hobby. This is a lifestyle." But in any event, so I got a lot of questions about bone broth. And I tried to, if I don't have your specific question, and I often get questions that are very similar to one another, so I tried to pull them all together. But if for any reason I don't address something about bone broth that you have a burning question about, be sure to leave it in the comments below. And I'll go through the comments, and I definitely will try to answer everything. But the question I got from a Mary Glidden, same name as me, Mary. Hello, Mary. And she's very sweet. She says she's grateful for the videos I share, which I am so happy to. And she says that she has several Ziploc bags of potato water and pasta water, which I often talk about saving these because they are wonderful to use. We'll get to the bone broth part in a minute, but they're wonderful to use in place of the water you use to feed your sourdough starter. They're both high in starch, and the yeast and good bacteria that proliferate your sourdough starter just gobble it up. And so sometimes if you're having a little trouble with your sourdough starter, and you, instead of just using your chlorine-free filtered water, you use some potato water, water that's been left over from cooking potatoes in, or water that's been left over from cooking pasta in, it can do wonders. So she's got this in her freezer, and she wants to know, can I use this for making my bone broth? Also, can I use less than perfect fruit over, this is, now she's also combined some questions here, but overripe for fermentations. So these are excellent questions. First of all, can you use the potato and pasta water to make bone broth? Definitely. There's no problem with any of that. The only thing you want to keep in mind is, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, if you're feeding people at your table who do a very low carb or a keto diet, that may concern them a little, because those waters do contain starch, carbohydrate. But if you don't have a problem with it, I say definitely the potato water and both the potato and the pasta water will add a little flavor to your bone broth. So you can definitely use those to make your bone broth. Now, I know we're getting a little out of order here, but since she did ask both questions together, I want to address it. Can I use less than perfect fruit overripe for fermentations? The thing is, you will often hear people today, and I'm not an exact person. I'm the person who tells you you never need a scale for anything. But I know that with the popularity of all of these traditional foods, making ferments, culturing dairy, making sourdough starters, people can become very exacting, very specific, and say you need so many grams of this, so many grams of that, weigh everything, measure everything. The food better be perfect, whatever you're fermenting, you better be starting with everything that's in pristine condition and whatnot. I'm kind of a little different school of thought. Maybe I'm like the rebel traditional foodist. I don't know what you would call me, but I don't think our ancestors worried so much about this. Yes, ferments, they can be so darn persnickety. And I often say, yes, kind of starting with the best ingredients, giving ourselves the best jump start, so to speak, using chlorine water, using sea salt, doing all these things may help jumpstart our ferment and get it moving in the right direction, because they can be persnickety. But when it comes right down to it, I have experimented using tap water, and my tap water has chlorine in it, and I've been able to ferment, and I didn't really notice a significant difference. Now, I've been fermenting a long time, so I kind of know exactly where in my house and exactly how much salt and where things are going to ferment the best and all of that. So that definitely plays a role. And when you're very new to fermentation, having everything kind of on the perfect side probably can help you a little, maybe boost you a little. But I don't worry too much if my fruit or vegetable doesn't look perfect. Now, do you want mold on them? No. But if they're a little, maybe they're just start to turn a little past their prime, I say go ahead and ferment them. That's a good way to preserve them so that you don't wind up having to throw them out or put them in your compost pile. But I think the biggest thing of this particular subject, using fruit or veggies that may be a little past their prime, is that if you have found where in your home is the best place for your ferments to be successful, that's going to play the bigger role. Most vegetable ferments like to be somewhere between 68 degrees Fahrenheit and 72 degrees Fahrenheit. A little cooler, a little warmer, it's not going to be the end of the world, but that's sort of the sweet spot. And when you can find that sweet spot in your home, which sometimes was in our master bedroom closet, God bless my husband, he could walk in and see something bubbling. But finding that sweet spot is really what plays the significant role in you having success with your vegetable ferment. Because temperature plays a much bigger role than the vegetable, the water, the salt. At least that's been my experience. So I think that if your vegetables are looking a little past their prime, but you're experienced with fermenting in the sense that you know in your home where your ferments have been successful in the past, chances are if your fruit is a little or your vegetables are a little less than perfect, they're going to be fine. Is a little less than perfect apples going to be fine for making, sort of a mock apple cider, raw apple cider vinegar? Definitely. I'm not going to worry about it. And something that I want to mention about, because Mary talks about fermenting fruit. Fruit ferments very quickly because it's very sweet. And clearly the more ripe it is, the sweeter the natural sugars have developed. So when you ferment fruit, it's a very quick process because it can very quickly turn to alcohol. So I often will say, if you're fermenting fruit, 2 to 3 days, boom, into the refrigerator. You're going to start, maybe even after day 1, starting to see some bubbling. And if in the second day you're seeing a lot of bubbling, boom, put it in the refrigerator. Maybe give it to the third day, but then get it in the refrigerator. Something that you always want to remember, and this is true of vegetable ferments as well, fermentation doesn't stop. It just slows down when you put it in the refrigerator. And that's why I often tell people who are new to fermentation, when you're doing vegetables, like you're making a sauerkraut, once you start to see some bubbles, you don't really need to go past 7 days. And definitely by 14 days, you want to get that in your refrigerator. And just let the fermentation continue in your refrigerator, just at a much slower rate. You're going to avoid getting a slimy ferment. You're going to avoid encountering maybe some other problems with mold or whatever the case may be. And that can really help boost your confidence that you're going to be successful with ferments. And then the one other thing I want to mention, and then I'll get back to the rest of the bone broth questions. The one other thing I want to mention is one of the best things you can invest in, and it's really no investment at all, it's very inexpensive, are pH strips. Because a ferment should have a pH of 4.6 or less. Then you know it's nicely acidic. You're not going to have any problems with the bad bacteria developing, because bad bacteria doesn't like to live in a very acidic environment. And being able to have that little pH strip that you can dip into a little bit of the brine that you remove from your ferment, and it starts to show that it's moving in the right direction. It's moving, because you can test it every few days, that it's moving towards an acidic pH, helps you know that you're on the right track. And then when you get to 4.6 or lower, it's very reassuring to know that what you've made has actually fermented and now is rich in good bacteria. The next question on bone broth comes from Greenfield's Home Place. And Greenfield says, I've saved the bones from rotisserie chickens, and when I have 3 or 4 carcasses in the freezer, I make bone broth. Mine never seems to gel like yours. Is chicken feet what gives it most of the collagen, and do I have to have this for good, healthy bone broth? Also, some people simmer their broth for over 24 hours or more. Is this necessary? Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Greenfields. Well, let's address the simmering first, the hours. I used to do this. I would simmer 24, 48, maybe 72 hours. And sometimes my bone broth wouldn't be particularly gelatinous. And that always surprised me. But I also found simmering bone broth for such a long time was very difficult to manage and maintain in the kitchen. Just if only, not just the time associated with having to keep your eye on it, but sometimes safety reasons. I didn't want to have to leave the stove on, and I didn't want to have to keep readjusting the slow cooker. It just seemed so excessive to me. So I was so happy when I read Sally Fallon's follow-up book called Nourishing Broth. Nourishing Broth was such an eye-opener because in that book, she discusses all different types of bone broth and how different cultures have made bone broth. It's a fascinating book, and I highly recommend it if you like making bone broth. But in the book, she discusses why it really is not necessary to simmer bone broth for such long hours, and how actually it can sometimes be detrimental. It can cause some problems by creating rancidity in the fat that will usually congeal to the top of the bone broth. It can, too long a simmering may do what you've probably heard me use this expression before, break the gelatin, meaning that your bone broth will not be gelatinous. Now, will it still be nutritious? Yes. But the gelatinous nature, because of this long simmering, and maybe at times it got too warm, because bone broth likes to be simmered at 180 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you get too much hotter than that, you start to lose some of its gelatinous nature. And maybe too long a simmering. I don't know specifically, but my personal experience was that, and I agree with what Sally shared in her book, Nourishing Broth, was 12 hours is sufficient for beef bone broth, and 6 hours is sufficient for chicken bone broth. And I was so happy to adopt that. Now, this is a simmering on a stovetop or simmering in a slow cooker. Now, have I made bone broth in an Instant Pot, and is that a very fast way to make it? Yes. And does it come gelatinous? Yes. Not as gelatinous as what I can make in a slow cooker or on the stovetop, but it is gelatinous. But what you're gaining in time, you're sacrificing in somewhat of the gelatinous nature. However, if you make your bone broth in your Instant Pot, it only takes a few hours, whether you're doing chicken bone broth or beef bone broth. And you always want to set it to low, and you're really only going to run it for about 2 hours or so. And you're going to get a very lovely, tasty bone broth. And yes, it will gel. It's not going to be so tight and thick the way it is when you do it on the stovetop or in the slow cooker. But I think that if that's easy for people, some bone broth is better than no bone broth. That's kind of my thought about it. So in any event, I think a simmer of 12 hours for beef bone broth and a simmer of 6 hours for chicken bone broth. If you like to make pork bone broth, which a lot of people refer to as liquid bacon, that also is a 6-hour simmer. If you want to make fish bone broth, which is basically nothing more than a fish stock, that's 45 minutes. And fish bone broth is wonderful. And you can often ask your fishmonger if he will sell you the carcass of a fish. I went to Whole Foods once, and I said to the fishmonger, I would like to buy just a fish carcass because I want to make fish stock. And I think initially first I said, can I buy the whole fish? I wasn't too excited about having to do that because of the expense associated with it. but I was, not really sure what to ask for at the time. And he was such a nice man, and he said, "Oh, you don't need to buy the whole fish. I'm going to be filleting these because people want to buy the fillets, and I will sell you the carcass." And I said, "Oh, can I have the head and the tail?" And he said, "Definitely." And he filleted his fish, and he put the carcass in some brown paper for me, and I think he gave it to me for about $2. And so I felt very empowered, to be able to just go to the fishmonger now and say, "Oh, can I just buy the carcass after you fillet the fish?" It's best to get there early in the day, because when they get their fish in, and they'll be starting to go in the back and fillet them, and while they still have the carcass, because that's just a little tip I want to share with you. And you want some sort of white fish. You want a non-oily fish, because the fats in fish can go rancid very quickly, like your omega-3s in salmon and whatnot. So you want just a carcass of a simple white fish, and like a flounder or something like that, and then 45 minutes on a very low simmer on your stove top, and you'll have a wonderful fish bone broth. But getting back to the beef, chicken, and pork, as you see, those numbers of those hours, I should say, of simmering are very manageable. And so I was very happy to read that. And why Sally in her book discusses this is, in addition to the things that I mentioned about the rancidity of the fat and maybe breaking the gelatin, I think she had some sort of nutritional analysis done of the bone broths, and the bone broth at 12 hours was very nutritious. So there was really no reason to go any longer than that. And I will give you a tip. What I do share in the bone broth videos that I share with you, and I have such an extensive playlist of bone broth videos, and I definitely will provide that playlist link for you. But what I find so interesting is that I will examine the bones after 12 hours, and sometimes the beef bones will still have some cartilage on them that is not melted. Sometimes the chicken bones will still have some cartilage, especially like the top of the legs and the thigh joint bones. Maybe the wings will still have some signs of cartilage in them that haven't completely melted. So I will fish all that out. The vegetables have basically been spent, but I will fish all the bones out, and I will save them, and I will make another batch of bone broth the next day. And I'll just refrigerate them and then make another batch the next day until I've leached all of that cartilage out of the bones, because it's the cartilage that is rich in the collagen. And when that collagen is cooked, it becomes gelatin. And that's what makes your bone broth gelatinous. So I will either make a batch the next day. If I think that I'm not going to be able to make a batch the next day, I will then put everything into my freezer, mark it well in one of my scrap bag containers, and then when I'm ready to, I'll fish that out, add fresh vegetables, and make another batch of bone broth. So getting back to the first part of this question that Greenfields has asked us, is that what is it about these 3 or 4 carcasses of rotisserie chickens that just doesn't seem to be creating her or him a gelatinous bone broth? And what I would ask is, if I could see these carcasses, is the cartilage still on top of like the leg bone? Or there's maybe some wing tips and that you've cut off the rotisserie chicken and saved that. They're very rich in cartilage. Is the cartilage still on top of, the top of the wing bone, the one that kind of looks like a little drumstick? Do the thigh bones still have that cartilage? is that piece on the breastbone that's all cartilage, is that still intact? You know, sometimes people will like to eat this, so if all of the cartilage has been removed from the carcass, you're kind of starting at a bit of a deficit. Is there collagen in the bones? Yes. And that will then be leached out into the bone broth, but it may not be sufficient enough to make a very gelatinous bone broth. So I would examine the carcass and see exactly what's going into your stock pot. If you find that your carcass has very little cartilage intact, then I have a couple of recommendations. If you can get chicken feet, you know, I love chicken feet. They're very reasonably priced. And if your grocery store sells them, and I've seen them a lot at my local grocery store, I've seen them at Walmart, you can often find them at ethnic grocery stores, throw in some chicken feet and throw in the number of chicken feet based on the number of carcass that you have. So if you have 3 carcass, that would be 6 feet. If you have 4 carcass, throw in 8 feet. 8 of the chicken feet. And that will definitely, that's going to make all the difference in the world. I have a video where I show you how to make a very cheap chicken bone broth using just chicken feet. And that can be very affordable, and the chicken feet are so rich in cartilage, and they make a very gelatinous bone broth. Now, what if you can't find chicken feet? What are some of your other options, and options that are still very affordable? If you've purchased chicken wings and you're going to make the dish chicken wings, you know, as an appetizer or even a main meal, cut off the little wing tips and save those, because generally no one eats those, and you're not going to use those maybe in your recipe. You're going to use the little, what do they call it, little drumette, and then the little wing part. Save the wing tip, and next time you go to make a chicken bone broth, using your rotisserie chicken carcasses, throw in those wing tips. What's another option? Chicken backs and chicken necks are also often sold in a package in the grocery store, and they're very affordable. And just throw in a couple of backs or throw in a couple of necks. And those will definitely help improve the gelatinous nature of your chicken bone broth. And although Greenfields didn't ask this particular question, I do want to add here, because I don't know if I have this in here, but it is something I often see in comments. People will ask me, can you mix various bones together? Like if you have beef bones, can you add chicken bones? Can you add chicken feet basically to any bone broth you make to make it gelatinous? And the answer is definitely yes. Beef bones have become more expensive, but say you want to make a beef bone broth, you can pick some more of your reasonable bones, like the patella or maybe some marrow bones, something like that. But then to that, you can add some chicken feet, some chicken backs, some chicken necks, chicken wing tips, whatever the case may be, and you can mix that all together. And those chicken parts that you're adding are all very, you know, as we talked about, cartilage rich. They'll release the collagen because cartilage is high in collagen. And then that collagen will cook up, become gelatin, and make your beef bone broth very gelatinous. So yes, you can mix bones. The only bones you don't want to mix in when you're making these longer simmering bone broths are, as I mentioned earlier, the fish bones, because fish bones, it's just a 45-minute simmer, and you really don't want to go any longer than that. And why? Because I don't think I mentioned that earlier. If you simmer fish bones too long, they can take on an off flavor. So when it comes to making beef bone broth or chicken bone broth, yes, you can mix them together. If you have a pig's foot, you can throw that in too. And so there's a lot that you can do. And don't worry if you're making a beef bone broth, because as I had said earlier, if you're doing a chicken bone broth or you're doing a pork bone broth, it's only a 6-hour simmer. And that's because that's really all that's necessary to help melt some of the collagen. But if you throw it into a beef bone broth, it's going to be in there for the additional 6 hours, which is fine. Don't worry about that. Chances are, when you take those chicken bones out, the majority of the cartilage will have been melted and into the collagen and then cooked into becoming the gelatin, and probably are spent at that point and won't be able to be reused for another batch maybe later to be added to a beef bone broth or for making a chicken bone broth. But your beef bones may very well be able to be reused. But yes, you can go ahead and mix bones. The next question comes from Shell Bell. That's a cute name. And what she's asking is, can she use red wine vinegar and in making beef bone broth? And then I'll get to the rest of her question. And the answer is yes. I tend to use fortified wines. What are fortified wines? Fortified wines are wines that have had the addition of other ingredients that make them a little more shelf stable so as to not turn into vinegar. And I don't drink, so being able to have fortified wines in my pantry, which are a little more shelf stable, and I don't have to worry about them turning into vinegar, makes it easy for me to have them in my pantry. They have a screw cap. I pour out my cup. I use that to soak my bones. And why are we doing that? I'll address in a minute. And then I can just put the screw top back on, put it in my pantry, and it stays very fresh. Unlike wine, once you open it, even if you put the cork in, within a month or so, maybe even faster than that, it'll start to turn into vinegar. And so then you're starting with vinegar regardless. But some people don't like to use any alcohol in making a bone broth. And I understand that completely. And so what you do want to do is you want to use some type of other acid. Wine, fortified wines, these are acidic. So what is another type of acid you can use? Vinegar. When you use a wine or a fortified wine, you're going to go with a cup. When you use a vinegar, you're going to want to pull it way back to about 1/4 of a cup. And the reason is vinegar is very strong, and you don't want to impart that strong vinegar flavor into your bone broth, because even after a 6 or a 12-hour simmer, it's still not going to be able to get rid of that acidic flavor if you were to use 1 full cup. So pull it back to 1/4 cup. You can use the red wine vinegar, as Shell Bell mentions in her comment. You can also use apple cider vinegar, any vinegar that you have on hand, anything that's acidic. Can you use things like lemon juice? Yes. But if you use lemon juice, you want to pull back even further to just a couple of tablespoons. Now, why are we adding this acid to our bone broth? This is also a question that I will receive frequently. The reason is, before we even turn the heat on, we want to soak our bones for about an hour in acidulated water to which some form of acid has been added, whether it's wine, fortified wine, vinegar, or some type of citrus juice. And the reason is, this helps jumpstart the process of leaching the collagen out of the bones. And as we leach that collagen out of the bones or out of the cartilage, we help with the process of creating a gelatinous bone broth down the road, so to speak. So we start to leach out all of that wonderful collagen, and that's going to be leached out into our liquid. And then as we simmer our bone broth, that collagen is going to cook into the gelatin and become gelatin. Shell goes on to ask about the proper temperature for simmering bone broth. She talks about using a slow cooker, and her slow cooker is telling her that the keep warm is between 165 and 175. And she's in the UK, one of my sweet friends from across the pond, as I like to say. And that is not warm enough. And especially from a food safety standpoint. So if you have a slow cooker and it's a digital, you have a digital readout and it can tell you what the temperature is, that's great. If not, it's worth investing in very inexpensive food thermometer that can tell you if you fill it with water, put it on warm, give it some time to warm up and see what the temperature is, what temperature it reaches to. And then you will know, because I have an old-fashioned one, you will know what keep warm is, you will know what low is, and you'll know what high is. Those are generally the 3 settings on a slow cooker. You really want to look for something that's 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if your low setting is a little higher than that, don't worry too much. Yes, you may sacrifice a little one way or the other in the gelatinous nature, but it's not going to be significant. Just like on the stove top, you're going to put it on your lowest setting, you're going to see bloop, bloop, just bubbling like that. That's going to be fine. You're going to have a great bone broth. Since her keep warm setting is a little low, she's going to want to use the low setting as opposed to the keep warm setting. Her bone broth's going to come out fine. You don't run into a lot of significant problems in terms of the breakdown of gelatin until you kind of start to get into the, 230, 240, 250 range, then you're going to run into trouble. But if you're maybe 230 or lower, 220, 200, you're going to get a nice gelatinous bone broth. You're going to be okay. Is 180 Fahrenheit the sweet spot? Yes. But if you can't get to that exactly, don't worry about it. And really no one's getting to it exactly. In a slow cooker, there are times it's going to be a little warmer, depending on how the slow cooker is operating. It might be a little cooler. Your stovetop, it's the same thing. The burners may click on and off, unless you're blessed to have a gas burner, which is delightful. I don't, I have electric. And so, it's going to click on and off. The big thing is you don't want a rolling boil. You want a very slow, low simmer where you see the occasional bubble, just like I often say in my videos, I describe it like bloop, bloop, bloop. I think we've all seen simmers like that. And that's basically all you're looking for. So you don't have to stress yourself. If it looks like it's on a low simmer and you just see those bubbles coming up, every few seconds, you're good and you're going to get a really nice bone broth. Next, I want to move on to culturing dairy. I think for the most part, people have become very comfortable with culturing dairy. Making yogurt, homemade yogurt, is not difficult at all. In the video that I share with you, I use 2 bowls. In the little bowl in the middle, I put in my milk. I put in a little bit of yogurt. It's the only one time you're going to have to buy a little plain yogurt with live cultures. I mix that up. I put that little bowl in a larger bowl. I put warm water in the larger bowl, which is now surrounding the smaller bowl. I put a lid on the smaller bowl, a lid on the larger bowl. I wrap it in a towel and I put it in my oven. My oven is off, but the electric light is on, and the next morning I have yogurt. And then once you make that initial investment into the plain yogurt that has the live active cultures that you buy at the grocery store, you don't need to buy that again. For all your future batches of yogurt, you're going to use some of your homemade yogurt. And so it's such an easy thing to make. And yes, there are you can do it in the Instant Pot, there are yogurt makers, but I always like to share with people the easiest way to do things without a machine. And that is probably one of the easiest, I think, traditional foods to make. And the same with kefir or kefir. Once you get the grains, you just add them to milk. That's a really easy thing to make because you don't have to worry about keeping anything warm. it cultures right on the countertop. And I highly recommend doing both yogurt and kefir. And the reason is they each bring different probiotics to the table, so to speak. And it's really just a matter of getting the grains that you need. And those could be from a friend or a neighbor who may be making kefir or kefir. You can also buy live grains online. You can also buy dehydrated grains. And I just want to mention a lot of these things that I talk about, whether it's beef bones or in the case now we're talking about cultured dairy, I have a lot of discount codes for you whenever you need to purchase these things. And I'll be sure to put that link in the description underneath this video, as well as in the pinned comment, and that'll take you over to my webpage. I have a whole page dedicated to discount codes that these companies have shared with me for my viewers, so that you can at least try to save a little money if you need to buy any of these things online. But specifically talking about cultured dairy, I really like the products, and I've used them a lot over the years from Cultures for Health. If you're a little concerned about your success at making homemade yogurt, just using some yogurt from the grocery store, they do have a whole variety of different types of yogurt cultures that you can try. That, you know, because there are many, many different strains of good bacteria for making yogurt, and Cultures for Health offers a wide variety, so that's kind of fun. They also sell dehydrated kefir grains that you can rehydrate if you'd prefer not to buy live grains, or you can't get live grains locally. And they're very easy to use. I've used them and I've had a lot of success. They also offer all types of things like sourdough starters and just a lot of things. And other than the kefir grains, you really don't need to buy any pre-prepared, so to speak, cultures, because they also have ones for culturing vegetables, you're making vegetable ferments. Most of this you can do without those things, but I know some people like the reassurance of having a starter culture as opposed to trying to develop your own starter culture. And I understand that, and that's why, you know, I do like to share this information with you. But know that you can make a sourdough starter without a starter culture. You can make yogurt without a starter culture that's dehydrated. You can just start it with a little bit of yogurt from the grocery store, as long as it has live bacteria in it. And you can ferment vegetables without a starter culture. So it's really just a matter of your level of comfort. But getting back to culturing dairy, JJ says, "Hi, Mary." She's very sweet. She says that she enjoys the videos that I share on making dairy products. And I'll definitely, you know, all of these I've put in playlists for you to make life very easy. And I'll link to all the playlists and I'll signify what's what, you know, dairy, sourdough, etc. So you can go right away to the subject you're interested in. But she had a very good question. She said, would you consider doing a printable cheat sheet on how to make all the different products? For example, the farmer's cheese, the ricotta, the sour cream, the butter, etc., as a quick reference guide for us new to developing this skill. I thought that was an excellent request. I have shared a lot of I like, she goes, cheat sheets with you. I have a lot of printable cheat sheets, but I don't have one as she has requested. So I will definitely get around to working on that. And when I've got that ready, I will definitely share that with you and do a video all about it. But those are all cheeses that I've showed you how to make. Not just cheeses. I've showed you how to do sour cream, cultured butter, ricotta, cottage cheese. So they're all easy to do, and they can all be done in your kitchen. And they're going to be much better than anything that you can buy at the grocery store. So I will definitely corral all of those into a playlist, and then I will eventually create that cheat sheet along, and I'll also link below to all of the cheat sheets I've shared with you so far on how to put together a traditional foods kitchen, how to stay in a budget, grocery lists. I have a 36-page pantry list that you can download, and that covers the whole Four Corners pantry. I think I call it my essential traditional foods pantry list, and it's so much more than just a list. It goes through everything that you will want to consider stocking in your Four Corners pantry for a traditional foods kitchen. I talk about the working pantry, I talk about the fridge, the freezer, and your extended pantry, your prepper pantry. But it's much more than a list. I have lots of links to recipes for how to use all the foods I tell you to stock to make delicious and nutritious meals. Plus, also in that list, I have lots of little tidbits, often addressing many of the questions that you may be thinking about in your mind or asking me. I cover different topics throughout that pantry list. That's why it's 36 pages long. And I have a big introduction in the beginning talking about the traditional foods kitchen, about the transition, to a traditional foods kitchen. And so I think you will find that very helpful. So definitely look for that link below. I highly recommend you can download that and just keep it on your computer or your phone. You can also print it out. And I think that is probably one of the most helpful documents for you, whether you're new to a traditional foods kitchen or even you're an experienced traditional foods cook, because I think it's a very helpful guide helping you make your shopping lists, and also making if you tend to be a meal planner, that can really be very useful to help you with your meal plans. Now, a lot of questions I get, and this is under the dairy umbrella, it's not specific to culturing, but the reason that I like to talk about culturing dairy is many of you have shared with me that all you can find at your grocery store is ultra-pasteurized milk and ultra-pasteurized cream. And I'm very sympathetic because I know grocery stores have really focused on carrying ultra-pasteurized dairy because it has a long shelf life. The problem is dairy when it's pasteurized and then ultra-pasteurized is that it's heated at a very high temperature. Now, is bad bacteria killed? Yes, but also a lot of good bacteria is killed. But I tell you not to feel bad about this and not to worry, because you can culture ultra-pasteurized milk and cream, and by culturing it, you're adding back in good bacteria. So you've now taken something that wasn't particularly nutritious and you've made it more nutritious. So that is something that I really like to share with you. If that's all you can find, don't worry. You can culture these things. You can use ultra-pasteurized milk and cream to make yogurt. You can use it to make kefir. You can use it to do a lot of things. You can even use your ultra-pasteurized cream to culture and then make a cultured sour cream. You can use your ultra-pasteurized cream to culture and make cultured butter. And its byproduct, real cultured buttermilk, that pale colored liquid that comes off of cream once it's turned into butter, that's real buttermilk. What's sold in the grocery store is a dairy product that's been cultured, but it's not, and it's called buttermilk, but it's not real buttermilk. It's not the liquid that came off of making cultured butter. But the nice thing is, now you have real cultured buttermilk, and if you put that in your refrigerator, it will thicken over time, and you'll have something very similar to what you could buy at the grocery store. And real cultured buttermilk is wonderful because you can use it in baking to make very tender baked goods. You can drink it. It's very rich in probiotics. So there's so much you can do, whether you're working with ultra-pasteurized milk or ultra-pasteurized cream, to reinvigorate it, so to speak, through culturing and make products for your home kitchen, your traditional foods kitchen, that have now been basically inoculated with good bacteria and made more nutritious once again. More nutritious in the sense that it's not raw milk, but it's better than what it was initially coming home from your grocery store. Next, I want to talk about a lot of the questions that I've received regarding fermentation. The next question comes from Princess, very cute. And she's very kind. She says that the channel is helpful, and that's what brings so much joy to my heart, because that's what I want to be. I want to be helpful. I want to be encouraging, and I hope that I am. I really want to help people on this, on this traditional foods journey. She's asked me if I can provide more videos on fermentation methods, not just in the jars as I normally share with all of you, but in crocks and etc. So that I thought was very interesting, and definitely as we go forward in the months to come, I will definitely show the process of fermentation in a crock. I have a crock. It has weights, and then you have the lid, and then you fill it with water to keep the air out, but then you'll see bubbles around it when the CO2 is being released, which is what is the gas that's created during the fermentation process. So if that is something that interests you, yes, I will definitely share how to ferment in a crock. And Brisbane Mad, which is cute too, she is also asking for more ferments, and any method, but just more cultured ferments. And I think that this is something that really does interest people, because so many of you have shared with me that you're looking for ways to incorporate good bacteria, the probiotics, into your diet, without having to buy costly, expensive, store-bought probiotics, which often, by the time you get them home, they've sat on the shelf and you get them home, often they're not as rich. I know many will say, oh, guaranteed X and such, but sometimes when you look at the small print, it says, guaranteed at the time of manufacture or something like that, which really, I think it was Sally Fallon who once said, there's more probiotics in a teaspoon or tablespoon of a homemade sauerkraut brine than in any probiotic you can buy over the counter, at the grocery store or the drugstore. So I think there's so much interest in ferments, and I have a lot of ferments, a lot of fermented vegetables as well as fermented fruits, and a lot of fermented beverages, and I have all of that, anything I've fermented, I have it all and made videos of, and have printable recipes over on my website. I've put them all into playlists. And again, like I've said with the others, I will definitely link to that playlist, and I will certainly be adding more recipes and printable recipes, more video recipes and printable recipes for more ferments. The next question comes from Cindy Rue, and she says, I'm currently learning fermentation, but having a hard time of it. I've been told it's basically a mathematical thing. I think you know what I'm going to say about this. I've been told it's basically a mathematical thing between the amount of salt to the weight of the food. Is this correct? I'm very confused on this and think it's possible that is why I'm failing at fermenting. I absolutely love you. Oh, she's sweet. She just says she loves the videos and is thanking me. What I will say about this, and I think I touched on it earlier, is that yes, you will read recipes and you will see videos where people are weighing and measuring everything. They're weighing and measuring the vegetable. They're weighing and measuring the salt. They're weighing and measuring the water. I can see how that would be very overwhelming and very intimidating. And if you don't have a scale, you're going to have to get a scale. It's not necessary. I can't imagine our ancestors doing this. And I know for a fact that my mother never did this. And my mother was one more to make, fermented vegetables more along the Italian lines. Like we would always have like a giardiniera, things like that, which is just a mix of vegetables in a brine that's been fermented, like cauliflower and peppers and things like that. But my father loves sauerkraut. And he is of Irish, he's passed away now, God bless him, but he was of Irish ancestry, but he worked at a little store when he was growing up, like a little market. We're talking the 1930s. And the man would, at the end of the day, would give him a big, thick piece of liverwurst. And next door to this little market was a bakery. And the lady there, my father would run over there and say, are there any chores I can do, whatever, and make a little extra money or something. And she'd give him a broom and he'd do some sweeping up. And then she would also give him 2 thick slices of rye bread. And she was a German lady, and she always had some homemade sauerkraut. And he would take the liverwurst with the sauerkraut, the 2 slices of rye bread, and he said he would sit on the curb before going home and eat that, and it was just like the best sandwich ever. This is 1930s. This is during the Great Depression. My father grew up extremely poor, and that just made his day. But when he married, my mother is of Italian heritage, and so things like rye bread and sauerkraut were unfamiliar to her. I mean, she knew of them, but it wasn't something that was in her culinary, you could say, repertoire. But she learned how to make. My father was able to find her rye bread. My parents lived outside of the New York City area. My father was able to find, he worked in New York City, and he was able to find rye flour. And she started making like a sourdough rye bread and homemade sauerkraut. And I'm telling you, it'd be in a bowl, she'd throw in some cabbage, she'd throw in some salt, she'd pound it a little, throw in more cabbage, throw in some more salt, pound it a little, then she'd put a plate into the bowl. She didn't have a crock or nut glass. I mean, probably the way I do it, she would look at us saying, wow, that's quite fancy. And she'd just put a plate that could fit into the bowl, and then she might put some kind of weight, like a can, maybe if she had some canned good, and she'd put that on to just weight it down. There was no weighing, there was no measuring, there was no nothing. And her sauerkraut was always great. So yes, are there exact ratios for perfection and all of this? Yes. But things that I have read from history books based on how German immigrants to the United States, even right here in Central Texas, made sauerkraut. It's often where, kind of like what my mother was doing, but they often had nice crocks, and they would put some cabbage, some salt, they'd have their little kraut pounder, and then put in more cabbage, more salt, and then weight everything down, because it would create, all of that pounding would create a brine. I don't remember my mother adding water. Probably if there wasn't enough brine, maybe she did. But the cabbage with the salt will often release a lot of liquid, and then weighting it down, and it's under the brine, and everybody's happy, and just let it ferment, and then you take some, put the plate back on, put the canned good back down on it, and so on and so forth. I don't really remember her ever refrigerating it, like I often recommend, but we probably ate it pretty quickly too. So that's my, as I often say to you, in my humble opinion, because I know I get a lot of flack for these things. So no, this is just my opinion, but I don't see the need to be so exact. And what I generally recommend is if you have a head of cabbage, an average size head of cabbage, say we're going to just go with plain old green cabbage from the grocery store. It's generally a little smaller than the basketball. It generally weighs about 3 pounds. You can even start weighing them on the scale at the grocery store to get a feel for what does an average size head of cabbage weigh. And that head of cabbage, once you chop it all up and pound it up in a bowl, should be able to fit into a half gallon. You'll notice I use the larger jars. You can definitely divide it between 2 quart-sized jars, but I generally put that amount of cabbage in a half-gallon jar, and then I add in basically 2 rounded tablespoons of a coarse ground sea salt. If you're using a fine ground sea salt, then you're probably just going to want to use a rounded tablespoon of a fine ground sea salt. And I have never had any problems with that. And I add everything into the jar. I don't add the salt separately to the water if I think I'm going to need some extra brine. I don't worry about any of that. I put the salt and the cabbage right in the jar together. This way I know I have enough salt and I've not left anything behind. And I find that, I think even, I don't know if I did this in a video or not. Maybe I'm going to have to do this. I think I weighed my rounded tablespoons of the coarse ground sea salt and my tablespoon of the fine ground sea salt, and I think it came close to whatever percentages the more exacting folks were recommending for 3 pounds of cabbage. So I think we're all close enough, and I don't think we need to become so fuss-budgety about it. And I think that if you stick with those measures that I share in my printed recipes, that it's going to be close enough and it's going to work out okay. I just want to jump ahead. This is unrelated to, well, I guess it is a fermentation in a sense, but it's not, we're not talking about vegetable ferments, but I just want to mention about sourdough. A lot of people get very worried and they get very frustrated, and I never want anybody to be frustrated. I don't want you to throw in the towel because you feel that it can't be exact. Our ancestors weren't exact. They did the best they could, and they looked at what was the result. You know, if it's a complete disaster, then maybe you say, okay, maybe I'll do it a little different next time. But they were not exact. And what I have found is that people get very worried about making the sourdough starter. And they're saying, oh, I better weigh the flour and the water. No, you don't need to do any of that. If you scoop flour into a measuring cup and then you measure water into a liquid measuring cup, they're going to weigh fairly close. You know, say like a cup and a cup. They're going to be fairly close in weight to one another, because a lot of sourdough recipes will say, or sourdough starter recipes will say, you know, equal weight water and flour. If you scoop the flour gently, don't compress it or anything, you scoop it gently into your measuring cup, whatever you're measuring. If you're doing 1 cup and 1 cup, and then you use a liquid measure cup, it looks like a pitcher. You use a liquid measuring cup to measure your water. It's going to be fine. It's going to be close enough. I have never weighed any of the flour and water I've used to make a sourdough starter. And I've been doing this for many years, and I haven't run into any problems. And once I get a good, healthy, and bubbling sourdough starter, I don't really measure at all. I dump in some flour, dump in some water, stir it till I'm happy with the consistency, and it's fine. This is what our ancestors did. And that's what I always want us to focus on. You know, if you've seen the banner of my YouTube channel, I say traditional cooking for the modern pioneer. We're pioneers in the kitchen. We're just living in modern times. And that's nice because we have, for the most part, most of us have running water and indoor plumbing, and I like being in the century in which we live, but I like being a pioneer too. I'm happy to be a modern pioneer, but I like the pioneer ways. I don't like getting all fussy about weighing and measuring and being exact. I've never been a very exacting person. I would imagine that if you knew me in person and you knew me for a long time, you would go, yeah, Mary likes to kind of wing it. And that's kind of how I am, but I feel that that relaxes everything. It just relaxes the whole process. So Cindy Rue, what I want to say to you is that don't worry about the mathematical calculations. Use about, if you're making a sauerkraut, use your head of green cabbage, use about 2 rounded tablespoons of a coarse ground sea salt, or a rounded teaspoon of the fine ground, 1 teaspoon of the fine, or 1 tablespoon of the fine ground sea salt. You're going to be fine. And you can really tell as you pound things and it starts to release the juices, the cabbage starts to release the juices. If you're creating enough brine, you've added enough salt, because the salt is what helps release the brine, release the liquid from the cabbage, because you eventually want everything submerged under the brine. So just jump in and try your hand at it and get the pH strips that I mentioned earlier, so that you can start checking on the fermentation process every few days to see if you're moving in the right direction. Because you don't want to add too much salt. You don't want to gild the lily, as they say. You don't want to add too much salt. Too much salt will hurt the potential of the good bacteria developing. And so that's why I share with you some general guidelines as to how much salt to use. But I think unless you were really going crazy with it, it's kind of hard to add too much salt. But I mean, like, if nobody's going to add like a full cup of salt. But on the other hand, just enough salt, a sufficient amount of salt, actually helps the fermentation process and helps the good bacteria. So there is a sweet spot, but not one that necessarily needs to be weighed and measured. So just follow what I shared, and then experiment with your pH strips to see if you're moving in the right direction. One more thing I want to mention about fermentation before I get on to the other questions. Then I'm going to take a second and refresh my fire. I think my fire went out, and it's so darn cold here right now in Central Texas. It's unusual for us. We're in like the low 40s, high 30s, which for this time of year is a little unusual. My husband and I were married here in this town in December. And we were married at 10 o'clock in the morning, and it was 60 degrees. But we're not having that weather right now. But I just want to mention that, so say you're not doing sauerkraut, say you're not doing cabbage. Chances are, if you are starting with 2 quart-sized jars, and when you make ferments, yeah, you don't need to be shy, make a lot. And that's why I always use a half-gallon jar. People love ferments, and they tend to go quickly because they're like pickles. They're pickled vegetables, or maybe you're actually making pickles. And people love that kind of tart flavor. And you can also, we'll talk about later, because the question does come up, about adding sweetener. And so you can get that sweet and sour taste. I think most people really enjoy them. But say you're using just some vegetables, like say you're making the giardiniera. Well, you may not have that 1 cabbage to weigh, so how do you know what is the right amount of salt to add? Chances are, if you're doing the half-gallon or the 2 quarts and you're filling it up with veggies, you throw in your 2 rounded tablespoons of the coarse ground sea salt, or the 1 tablespoon of the fine ground sea salt. It's going to be enough, and it's going to work. And then you're going to pour in, with vegetables like that you're not necessarily mashing and aren't releasing a lot of liquid, you're going to add in some water, and then that salt and the water are going to mix together and make your brine, and everything's going to start fermenting, and it's going to be wonderful. So just be flexible. add the amount of salt that I recommend, and I think that you will have success and you don't have to worry about any mathematical calculations. The next question on fermentation is asked by Vanguard Iris. And Iris asks, do you have any tips for what to do with a neglected but not moldy kombucha? So I wasn't sure if Iris meant the liquid, the actual kombucha, or the SCOBY. And I'm thinking that she's referring to the SCOBY. That is the gelatinous mass that you use to make kombucha, the liquid that you then drink. And the SCOBY, you'll often see it presented in all capital letters because it's an abbreviation for the term symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. That's what a SCOBY is. And so I'm thinking that, Iris, and I hope I'm right, that you're talking about your neglected SCOBY, because I'm assuming you've drank your kombucha, unless maybe you just have the SCOBY sitting in the kombucha and maybe it's just been neglected, the whole thing altogether. Generally what happens when you do that, you may notice that your SCOBY has started to grow significantly, and maybe at some point it starts to just slow down in its growth, because SCOBYs tend to grow very aggressively. They're actually been trained, I guess, over the centuries to the nourishment that they rely on is caffeine, and that's why generally your best kombuchas are made with caffeinated tea, some type of caffeinated tea. Some people do have luck, doing herbal kombuchas and whatnot, but generally the SCOBY has been bred, for lack of a better word, to eat caffeine. And so that's why kombucha is usually made with some sort of black tea. But in any event, I think that what you can do is that now I have sort of my ultimate guide to how to make kombucha, where I show you how to make it, and I deal with a lot of question and answers relating to problems with a kombucha, and I'll definitely, when making kombucha, and I'll definitely link to that. And I think what happens when you neglect it, I think I've shared this story with you in the past, I'm sure. I neglected mine when I first started making kombucha. A friend someone had given her a SCOBY. She didn't know what the heck to do with it, so she gave it to me. My gosh, the thing grew to a size of a small tire. And what a time I had getting it out of the jar. It was just a mess. But if you have just have your SCOBY sitting in the tea and it's really been neglected, you should be able to pull that SCOBY out and try to get the newest child, as they call them, which would be usually the new SCOBY, on the bottom. The other SCOBYs you'll want to relegate to your compost pile because they're older and maybe not as productive. Some people will cut them up and dry them and make like a jerky out of them. I've never tried that. I can't recommend it one way or the other. Other people will cut it up and throw it in their garden. Some people put it in their compost, as I said, But you'll want to pull off that layer of your newest SCOBY and then just start the whole process all over again with fresh tea, fresh sugar, soa, or whatever sweetener you use in making kombucha, and just start the whole process all over again and see if you are able to make a fresh batch of kombucha with your new, in essence, young baby, whatever you call it, SCOBY. The next question comes from the Ginger Rose Garden, and she writes, when doing fermentation, can you add sugar to a finished fermented food if you want a bit of sweetness? And the answer is definitely yes. And this goes back to something I talked about earlier, making things tasty, making them palatable, making them attractive, especially to those who are new to eating traditional foods. And I often say that the closer you can get your homemade foods to taste like store-bought, the better you have in transitioning not only your own palate, but everybody else's palate to eating these types of foods. And I remember years ago my father saying something to the effect of telling someone it tastes just like store-bought was a really good compliment when they were making traditional foods. Because the more you can get your pickles or your sauerkraut or your fermented vegetables, whatever the case may be, the more you can get them to taste as if they had just come out of a jar that you pop the cap off of that came from the grocery store, the better. But the secret is, as Ginger Rose says in her question, to the finished ferment. Yes, you want to add your sweetener to the finished ferment. And the reason is sugar of any type, whether it's honey, whether it's, and we'll talk about honey in a minute, whether it's honey, whether it's sucanat or rapadura, the dried sugar cane, the dried whole sugar cane, whether it's maple sugar, date sugar, coconut sugar, whatever you use, sweeteners, because of the fact that they're sweeteners and rich in simple carbohydrates, are gobbled up by good bacteria, and it can make the fermentation process go very quickly. And you can run into a couple of problems. You can create something that's slimy, and you can also start to create alcohol. So you always want to add your sweetener at the end, right before you refrigerate your ferment. And I show you how to do this in my video and printable recipe that accompanies it, where I add the sweetener to the red cabbage, which is often sweet if you buy it at the grocery store. My fermented red cabbage, I add the sweetener at the end, right before I refrigerate it. And I'm telling you, that is delicious. You've got to try that recipe. It will taste very much like the jar of red cabbage from the grocery store. So yes, you can add sugar at the end. Ginger Rose uses the word sugar. I would recommend using some type of whole sweetener, as I mentioned earlier, like maple sugar, maple syrup, rapadura, sucanat. I believe in Europe it's referred to as rapadura. Here in the United States, it's called sucanat. That's the dried whole sugar cane. Date syrup, molasses might be a little strong, but coconut sugar, coconut syrup, any of these will work very well at sweetening your ferments. But you want to add that right before you put it in the refrigerator. Now, I just want to take a minute to talk about honey. I think most of us as parents know we never want to give honey to a child that's under the age of 1. And if you want to start introducing honey into your child's diet after the age of 1, it's always a good idea to first check with your pediatrician. But what about honey in ferments? In the past, I was always hesitant to add honey to my ferments because honey is an antibacterial. So I was worried, yes, it would kill bad bacteria, but would it also kill my good bacteria? But what I learned was that honey kills bacteria through the process of suffocation. And that's why sometimes in the old-fashioned days, so to speak, if people had a wound or something, they would put the honey on it. The honey killed the bacteria simply by suffocating it, because it made that thick, gelatinous, the way honey is, very gelatinous, on top of the wound. It would suffocate and the bacteria would die. When you mix honey with liquid, now it's watery and it loses its suffocation properties. So it's not going to kill the good bacteria in your ferment because it's being mixed with the brine. So you can feel very comfortable in adding honey to the brine of a ferment that you want to sweeten. But just remember, the key is add any sweetener that you want, but add it at the point of when the fermentation has reached a satisfactory level for you at room temperature and you're now getting ready to put it into the refrigerator. Sarah Barton asked the question, and it's cute. She says, I have been too nervous to try making fermented sauerkraut because I haven't gotten a proper crock pot with a one-way valve. and she doesn't want to give her family upset stomachs. I understand completely. And she said, please, can you help me? Well, I want you to know you don't really need any special crock or special equipment, one-way valve or whatever the case may be, to make a ferment. And, you know, I've kind of touched on this throughout the fermentation section. As I show in my sauerkraut video, what I do is I have that half-gallon jar. I then use, I don't have any pickle pebbles or a pickle pipe, nothing like that. I have a 4-ounce jelly jar, you know, like a ball canning jar that's 4 ounces, but you could use any small jar that you have. Sometimes the ones that come from the grocery store with the pimentos in them, little jar like that, some 4-ounce jar. I put that into on top of my sauerkraut and I push it down. The brine rises up. Extra brine may spill over into the little jelly jar. That's fine. It just adds extra weight, and that weights everything down and keeps all of the cabbage under the brine. Then all I use is one of those white storage lids that are available, you know, generally are the storage lids used for canning jars, but any lid you have will work. And I just screw that on, and when I do that, it's putting pressure usually on the jelly jar, getting everything to fit and tight and keep everything under the brine. That's how I ferment. And although I have used the mason tops, pickle pebbles and the pickle pipes, those are great. And I mentioned earlier about discount coupon codes. I have a discount coupon code for you for the mason tops supplies. And, you know, that's over on my website. You know, when you find the link in the description that you can click, that'll take you over to my shopping page, my shopping guide, where I have all these discount codes. They're wonderful. And if they're in your budget and you want to buy them and you get a discount, that's nice. But you really don't need anything special. I always really want to make that clear. You have a jar, you have a large jar, a small jar, and a lid. You can make a ferment. And especially sauerkraut, and which is, I think, probably one of the easier ferments to start with. And all you have to remember is when you don't have one of those pickle pipes, as they're called, or Sarah's referring it to as the one-way valve. You know, there are all sorts of fermentation equipments. The pickle pipes are just one. Some have these various contraptions on top that I think release the CO2 and whatnot. But the bottom line is, if you don't have any of this, all you want to do is when you see your ferment starting to bubble, that means the CO2 gas is being created, the carbon dioxide. That's a byproduct of the fermentation process. All you want to do is loosen the lid. You may hear whoosh, and then tighten it again. And then the next day, loosen it, whoosh, you know, and tighten it again. Now, is it a little more labor intensive than having a pickle pipe or some sort of other one-way valve? Yes, but it's not a major thing. But you do want to remember, you know, because you don't want too much gas to build up in your jar, especially if you've made the lid very tight. You don't want to, you know, develop a situation where you have breakage of your jar. But generally, those the new gray lids that Ball has made, the Ball company has made for canning jars, those are supposed to be airtight. I don't use those when I ferment. I use the old-fashioned white storage lids, which are not airtight. And I make sure to always, I just want to share this tip with you. It's what didn't come up in questions, but always put your jar in a bowl, because especially when you use just a plain lid that's not airtight, a lot of your brine may bubble out as the CO2 gas becomes very active and the fermentation process really takes off. Having that bowl to catch some of that brine really helps keep everything neat and clean. So Sarah, if you just have a large jar and a small jar and a lid, you can definitely successfully make a sauerkraut. And the only thing I would recommend to give you peace of mind, because you're such a lovely person, not wanting to cause any members of your family to have upset stomachs, which I think most of us as home cooks are very conscious of, never wanting to make anyone feel ill. Investing in those pH strips, I think will be very helpful to you and give you reassurance that once your ferment reaches, or your sauerkraut in the case that you're asking, reaches 4.6, you can go ahead and refrigerate that and it'll be safe to eat. Now, we just talked about those little pickle pipes. They're made of silicone. They have a tiny little hole on the top that lets out the CO2 gas, but then it quickly closes again, not letting any air in. Air is the enemy of fermentation. So that's why even if you're just using a jar lid and you're burping it, you want to do it quick. You don't want to have a lot of air getting into your ferment, because fermentation of this type is anaerobic, meaning without air. Are there aerobic type fermentations, like when making vinegar? Yes, but that's a whole nother story. Aerobic fermentations when making vinegar require the bacteria Acetobacter, which is just in the air. And that's why you stir your vinegar. If you've seen my vinegar videos, you stir it every day, maybe twice a day, and you just keep a cloth or a coffee filter on top, but you want the air. Anaerobic fermentations, which are lactoferments, like these vegetable ferments, you want to keep air out, and you want the good bacteria that is an anaerobic bacteria to proliferate. So that is, and we're going to discuss this anaerobic versus aerobic bacteria as we get into discussing sourdough starters. And many of you had questions for me, why does your sourdough starter smell like acetone, which is, or sometimes you'll say nail polish remover, or very vinegary, and we're going to discuss why that happens and how to rectify it. It's very easy to fix. And some people may not even want to fix it, and I'll share a little bit about that as well. But in any event, getting back to the pickle pipes, D.Ep says, what does it mean when the silicone self-burping lid, that's that little thing that I refer to as a pickle pipe, is sucked down into the jar of sauerkraut? And when I have used pickle pipes, sometimes this has happened to me. It just means that it's a very active ferment. And because of the different chemical reactions going on in that ferment and all of that gas, and the little hole may not be able to release things fast enough. This is my theory, and it just kind of all goes whoop, and you'll see that that silicone lid will be pulled down into the sauerkraut. All I recommend is you want to loosen your canning band, or some people call it the canning ring or the canning band that is holding the pickle pipe in place, readjust the pickle pipe, retighten your canning band or ring, and then when you do that, you might even want to check on your ferment. It may have reached the proper acidic level that you like. Now, I've been mentioning about the 4.6. That's kind of the indication of safety. It's now acidic, bad bacteria can't really proliferate, and so your ferment was successful. But a lot of people like their sauerkraut to come in lower than 4.6. They want it to be a little tangier. And so, you can let it go down to 4.0, 3.5, so on and so forth. But don't let it sit on your counter so long where it does have the potential of becoming a little mushy or slimy. That's why I always say, especially when you're new to ferments and you're trying to discover what is the best place in your kitchen or in your home to ferment, get it into your refrigerator. It's going to be fine, and it'll continue to ferment just much slower. It'll stay a little crunchy, and it'll just be a very nice, tasty sauerkraut, because the enemy of fermentation is slime. And slime develops if it's too warm, if the fermentation goes too fast, if you leave it on the counter too long. The slime can develop for a lot of different reasons, but that's going to make the most, at least in my humble opinion, I just find it so unpalatable and unpleasant. And you never want that. You want your ferments to be bright and crisp and have a pleasant tang. And the nice thing is, ferments, I really think that this can be a very nice trait about ferments when you're introducing them to people who are used to pickled things at the grocery store that have been pickled in vinegar. Ferments often have a more mild tartness or tang to them than things pickled in vinegar. And so that can be nice for children too, because it is a little milder in flavor, and then if you sweeten it, all the better. Well, this has become quite the long-form video, but I'm not going to leave you hanging. I'm going to break this into 2 parts, and in the meantime, if you want to learn more about how to master the basics of traditional nutrient-dense foods cooking, be sure to click on this video over here where I have a full playlist. It's a masterclass, and I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.